In this screencast, we will look at the rock cycle. The rock cycle isn't really a cycle. Normally, a cycle would go around in one direction in a circle. In the rock cycle, one type of rock can turn into any other type of rock and vice versa. So the definition of the rock cycle is the constant formation and destruction of rock. The rock cycle recycles minerals and elements. So let's look at the three major categories of rocks and how they're formed. The first one is called igneous rock. I think of the word IGN like as in ignite, as you ignite a fire. Igneous rock is formed when magma from the mantle rises up and the magma cools and crystallizes and forms the igneous rock, such as granite, which makes up most of the continental crust, and basalt, which makes up much of the oceanic crust. A second type of process that can occur is the formation of sedimentary rock, such as sandstone and limestone. Notice the word sediment. So what happens is any type of rock, be it igneous rock, metamorphic rock, or even another sedimentary rock, begins to weather, break down, and it's transported and compressed and glued together almost in a different form of rock, and that would be sedimentary rock. The third type of rock is metamorphic rock. To morph is to change, and meta meaning great. So to go through great change due to great heat and great pressure. Any type of sedimentary rock or igneous rock or even a metamorphic rock can turn into another type of metamorphic rock under that great heat and pressure. And that's how marble and quartzite are formed. Now that you know the three types of rock, the igneous, the metamorphic, and the sedimentary rock, let's take a look at how these rocks form along each of these arrows. So we have the magma rising up, cooling, and forming igneous rock, which has a particular crystalline structure. Igneous rock can be uplifted to the surface as plates collide. So can metamorphic rock or sedimentary rock. Then weathering and erosion, which we'll talk about in just a minute, will occur to break down the rock and transport it. That would be the formation of sedimentary rock. Some of that sedimentary rock, some of that metamorphic rock, and some of that igneous rock will also be subducted underneath as plates collide. And when it's subducted, it becomes warmer and melts and becomes magma again. So on the next slide, we will look at the weathering and erosion portion of this process. So now, as part of the rock cycle and part of the greater piece, the tectonic cycle, we will look at changes that take place near the surface of the Earth. And there are three interrelated but distinctly different processes: weathering, erosion, and deposition, and a fourth process, soil formation. So first, let's look at weathering, erosion, and deposition. So the first part of this process is weathering. Rocks are exposed to either air, water, chemicals, or biological agents which degrade or break down the rock. So there are two types of weathering: physical weathering and chemical weathering. Physical weathering is a mechanical breakdown of the rocks and minerals, whereas chemical weathering is a breakdown of rocks and minerals by chemical reactions. So let's look at some of the reactions that can happen. Here on the left, we have a rock, big boulder actually, and it has some cracks in it. Water can get into those cracks. And remember the properties of water. It might freeze. And when it freezes, water expands. As it expands, it breaks apart the rock. So water turning to ice and physically breaking apart the rock is one example of physical weathering. In this next picture, we have a tree with roots going into the rock. That's typically physical weathering, where the roots pushing in through the rocks, cracks in the rocks, are breaking apart the rocks. This last example, where you have, for example, limestone caves, are an example of chemical weathering, where the rocks and minerals are broken down by chemical reactions. Things like acid rain would be an anthropogenic cause to that, but also natural causes. For example, limestone, the calcium carbonate in the limestone dissolves easily, and that can result in this chemical weathering. One other example of chemical weathering is when you have lichen. Lichen come in early in the succession process when you start with bare rock, and mosses and lichen can grow on that rock. Lichen emits acids, certain chemicals that help to break down the rock, and that's the early part of succession, ecological succession. So that's the first step, weathering, the breakdown of rock. The next step is erosion, which we'll look at on the next slide. Erosion is the physical removal of rock fragments from a landscape or ecosystem. The rock is carried by wind, water, or ice, and sometimes by living organisms. The third part of the process is deposition. Deposition is the depositing of eroded material, such as sediment, rocks, fragments, or soil, to another location. So to recap, 3 distinct terms that are related: weathering, the breakdown of rock; erosion, the movement of the rock; and deposition, the depositing of the rock. Okay, so now we're going to look at the next process, which is soil formation. And we'll start with the reasons soil is so important to living things. First of all, it's the medium for plant growth. That means that plants need soil, which is a mixture of geological components and organic components, in order to bring in nutrients through their roots and in order to grow. Soil also helps to anchor the tree so it can stand upright. A second important factor for soil is that it breaks down organic material and recycles nutrients. So here we have some leaves on the ground here. There are living organisms, lots of bacteria and other microorganisms, worms and things like that, living here, and they help to break down the material, the carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus that were found here in the litter layer, and provide nutrients for further plant growth. Soil also serves as a habitat for a variety of organisms, and very importantly, it filters water. That's important because these cleaning functions, not just these returning the nutrients to the soil, but the water is actually cleaned up, and that's of importance to us. Remember when we talked about septic systems and how there was a leaching field, and the septage, the liquid part of the sewage, will go out through perforated pipes, and the water goes into the soil where it's cleaned before it reaches the aquifer. Now we're going to take a look at 5 factors that determine the formation of soil. First is parent material. You probably remember from lab. Parent material is the rock and mineral material from which the soil is formed. So it just depends what happened to have been deposited in a particular location. The second factor that determines the formation of soil is climate. Soil forms more quickly in climates that are warm and humid. A third factor is topography. What is the surface of this particular region like? Is it a hilly? Is it mountainous? So it takes a little longer for soil to form on a hilly or mountainous area because some of that soil is going to be washed away. And valleys tend to have a deeper, richer soil, more mature soil because of their topography. A fourth factor that influences the formation of soil are the organisms that live there. And again, that also has to do with climate. And fifth is time. Soil takes a long time to form, and the amount of time a soil has spent developing without being disturbed determines some of the soil properties. Topsoil typically takes about 100 years to form, so that's a long time. This diagram shows three types of soil: immature soil, young soil, and mature soil. And immature soil, the parent rock is weathered and fragments begin to move upward, but there is only a very little bit of topsoil there. Young soil, the organic material begins to accumulate as plants and other organisms die, and they enrich the soil here, and the topsoil gets deeper. Mature soil is soil that has a lot of organic material, and that, of course, is the period of time that takes the longest to get to that state. So mature soil actually has a topsoil portion, which is about 6 to 12 inches, and then subsoils, various layers of subsoil follow. As soils form, they develop characteristic layers. You don't need to memorize these layers. I'm just showing this as to put things in context. The topmost layer is called the O horizon, and the O stands for organic. That's where there's a lot of organic matter in various stages of decomposition. So if you dug into that soil, you might see bits of sticks and leaves and so forth. And the next soil down, the A horizon, is the topsoil. That's the zone overlying organic material mixed with underlying mineral material. And again, that's typically 6 to 12 inches. Beyond that, we have subsoil, or B horizon. And here there are metals and nutrients are starting to accumulate. You can see in the diagram here, it is shown as brown. It's just not as rich as the topsoil. And last is the C horizon, which is also a subsoil, and that's the least weathered portion of the soil profile. So we only have a few minutes left, and I have a few things to say about the properties of soil. So that will continue on another screencast.